This is The Sweater with Kathleen Dames. Over our 12-episode season, I will share some of my best sweater knitting techniques with you while we knit a sweater together. Hello, my friends. Thank you so much for joining me. This is The Sweater with Kathleen Dames, and today is episode 3, the cast on. I'm your guide, Kathleen Dames, and over the course of 12 weeks, we will knit the solstice cardi together. Today, we will be talking about the cast on, which is exciting because we're finally getting to the real deal, right? And even though in the pattern, I list the body first, I do recommend casting on a sleeve first as sort of a secondary gauge swatch. You can double check your gauge. It's not as big a commitment as knitting the body. You don't have to cast on as many stitches. And then the best part, and I mentioned this before, is there's no chance of second sock or second sleeve syndrome because you've already knit one, then you're gonna knit the body, then we'll knit the other sleeve, and then we'll put them all together. But if you knit the body and then sleeve one, and then you have to do another sleeve, it's just, oh, it's a bummer. So yeah, most of you probably know the long tail cast on. That's the basic slingshot cast on. It's great. It provides a nice firm edge. And the cool thing about it, if you look at it closely, you work the cast on edge and the first row all in one go. Many years ago, I was encouraged to try provisional cast-ons because if you do that and let's say you're making a sweater and you haven't decided how you want the bottom edge to be, or you want to be really sure that the edges match from the hem to the cast off at the neck, if you start with a provisional cast on, you can go back, pick up the stitches, work your way down and bind off and everything matches. So most people do a provisional cast on with a crochet chain. Well, one of my failings is I cannot crochet. It's just not, I can make a chain, but back when I was learning about things like provisional cast-ons, I could not for the life of me knit into the crochet chain and do it properly, and it just made me mad. So I went searching for alternatives, and the one I found that I really liked was this knitted provisional cast-on, and it basically involves tying your working yarn to some waste yarn and using those two as the tails for your long tail cast on. And I thought that was great, and I used it. And then a little bit later, I wondered about using having both the provisional and the working yarn, just doing away with provisional yarn and using working yarn for both. Why not? And the great thing about it is you will never run out on your cast on. I mean, that's my biggest complaint about the regular long tail cast on is you have to estimate how much yarn you're gonna need. Sometimes you are casting on 200 stitches for the hem of a sweater, and all of a sudden you're at 197 stitches and you have this much yarn left. And you have to pull it all out, do it all again. It's just incredibly frustrating. This way, you could cast on like around the globe if you had enough yarn, but you won't run out of yarn until you run out of skeins. So here's what we do. I like to do this also. The other benefit to this when working especially with a hand dye is you can blend the two skeins right from the very beginning. So what we're going to do is drop our yarn on the floor. I've got two skeins and the tails from both. You could also do this in the inner and outer tails, but I am using this for a number of reasons, one of which is blending the skeins. So we'll start like that. So I make a slip knot and slip it on to my needle. So that's sort of like how you start a long tail cast on. And when you're using your two yarns, it doesn't matter which skein is top or bottom, or however you'd like to think about it. If you were doing a provisional cast on, you'd want to make sure that the provisional yarn ends up as the cast on edge on the bottom. So now I'm going to do just my usual long tail cast on using the tails from two separate yarns. And I can keep going as long as I want. Seriously, whole skeins worth. And I just cast on until I have enough. We'll just do a quick, I don't know, 15 stitches here. Okay, so now I have two strands. I could, if I didn't want to alternate skeins, just break one. And that certainly would be the best thing to do if you're using the inner and outer tails of a skein, otherwise you get a lot of twist. They get all tangled up. But since I want to alternate skeins, I am going to use one skein, and that now becomes skein A. I mean, it really doesn't matter what you call it. I'm going to knit with that skein. And the thing to know, and leave the other skein just hanging there. It's going to hang out. The one thing to be aware of is on the first row, when you get back to it, you're going to drop the slip knot off and undo it. Or I guess you could leave it tied. Don't get it tied too tight, because at the end we're not going to want that knot on our sweater. I'm getting close. And so also be sure not to count the slip knot as one of your stitches when you're casting on. Consider it to be stitch 0, and it has to go away at the end. Okay, so I've gotten there. I'm just going to pull my slip knot out. There they are, they're hanging out. I have just knit row 1. I'm now going to knit my second row. This is why I only did 15 stitches, so that we could keep going. And I'm going to get all these tails out of the way. That is the thing, you will have an extra tail, but I think it's so worth it. It's such a small problem to just weave in an extra tail for the benefits that you get here. All right, and we're going back, and there's one thing I forgot to do on this first row, and we're going to forgive me for that, and we're going to remember it on all subsequent rows. But actually, it only applies when we are working the body. So we're working a sleeve. We don't want to slip any stitches when we're working the sleeve, because we're going to seam it up. And when you slip the stitches, like if you slip the first stitch of the row, which we'll do on the body, and we're going to slip it purlwise and then move the yarn to the back between the needles. When you do that, you are working one stitch every other row, and that makes a nice chain edge on the body, but it makes the edge a little tight for when you're seaming a sleeve together. So while we're working on the sleeve, don't slip any stitches. Okay, so I've reached the end of my row. Yay! Now I'm ready to switch skeins. So here was the tail from the working yarn. I'm now going to drop that and pick up the skein B yarn. And I'm just going to start knitting. Don't pull tight when you're switching skeins. Just be gentle, give it a little extra room, because you don't want, again, we don't want the edges to be tight where we're going to be doing the seaming. And now we go back and forth 2 rows with skein B. So we're going to alternate, and that means we're going to blend the colors. Especially if you're doing hand-dyed yarn, it can be, even if they're in the same dye lot, same bag, whatever, there can be differences in color. And working it this way, you get a nice cohesive fabric and a cohesive color. It just presents much better. Okay, so now we have cast on and we've got our stitches going. I'm working the garter stitch edge of my sleeve. I'm now going to pretend I'm a little further along so that I can show you guys how to do the increases. And just like casting on, there are lots of different ways to cast on. There are a number of different ways to increase. And I would guess that the first one you learned was knit into the front and back of the stitch. And that's a great increase. It's easy to work. It has a few, I don't want to say problems, it has pluses and minuses. If you are working in garter stitch or seed stitch or ribbing, it's great because that second stitch, the knitting into the back of the stitch, creates a little purl bump, and you can use that to your advantage. However, when you are working in stockinette, which is what we'll be doing for the portion of the sleeve where you're going to do your increases, those bumps can stand out a little. And even though it's under the, it's on the inside of the sleeve and it's not really visible, we still can make a nice smooth increase. Now the second increase that most people learn after knit in front and back is what's called the lifted increase, where you lift the bar of yarn between 2 stitches up onto the needle, and you either twist it as you put it on the needle or you knit into the back of it as you're working it. And that the twist closes up any little hole. And that's a good increase. But I like to do what's called a make one, which takes that one step further. And with the make one, instead of knitting into the bar in the row below, you are creating a new bar, a new stitch with your working yarn. And the advantage to that is that it doesn't borrow any yarn from the stitches on either side of it. And that's really a good thing. So there's no bunching up, it's very smooth, even. If your tension's even, it's great. So what you do is you make a loop. If you've ever done an E-wrap cast on, this is basically you're making a backwards loop and putting it on the needle. And you can twist it either way. So I like to do one way at the beginning of the row and the other one at the end of the row in the other direction. And so then they're paired and they have a tiny little bit of an angle. If you really don't feel like it, you can just do one. It's okay. But if you want it to be really symmetrical and pretty, I recommend figuring out how to twist it both ways. And you're just making this loop around your finger and then sliding that onto the needle. And then in the next row, you just work it normally. So in this case, since we're working back and forth, we just purl it. Don't do it into the back of the stitch or the front of the stitch. It's already twisted because we have twisted that loop onto the needle. So I'm just getting to the end and I'm gonna do my other one. And I like to do my increases 2 stitches in from the edge so that I have a little space before for seaming. Some people like to do it in 1 stitch from the edge, but I found I had a hard time doing the seaming right there where the increases are happening. So you really can't see it. I'll do a close-up later. They're really nice and smooth. I have a friend who likes to do these increases. She does a yarn over on for the increase, and then she knits into the back of the stitch on the way back. And that's certainly another way to do it. The great thing about doing make ones regularly is if you do forget, on the next row you can lift up the bar and you have that as your backup increase method. Okay, so we have now cast on. We've talked about increases. Let me remind you again on the sleeves not to slip your stitches because it just it tightens the fabric up and you may not mind it, but it really can make the difference between a nice smooth area at the seam and not. Okay, the one other thing, I've talked about it before and I'm going to talk about it again now, is working flat versus in the round. I really want to encourage you, if your gauge is different, flat versus in the round, to work your sleeves flat and seam them up. Because they are just these sort of 1/2 to 2/3 length sleeves, it's not a long seam it's not a long seam to sew. If your gauge is close enough or you're happy with it, you can certainly knit your sleeves in the round. A lot of times people recommend taking away 1 stitch because that stitch is usually eaten up by the seam. I think at this gauge, in this instance, I wouldn't bother. So if you're comfortable, if you feel like your gauges are close enough and you want to knit your sleeve in the round, cast on the same number of stitches. I would work the hem back and forth, and then I would join for the round when I started, when I was ready to start doing the stockinette. And don't forget to place a marker in that instance. Now, the one last thing I think I need to cover is if you want longer sleeves. And before I get any further with that, I want to remind you that if you want longer sleeves, if you are making adjustments to my pattern, which is totally fine, you are the boss of your knitting, but if you are making changes, you are going to need more yarn. I don't want you to be disappointed. I don't want you to run out here because that would make you cry, that would make me cry. We want to have a great sweater, so make sure you have enough yarn. The first 3 sizes I think generally call for up to 800 yards. That's 2 regular skeins of sock yarn. Get a 1/3 if you're worried. If you want it longer than high hip, if you want longer sleeves, you're going to need more yarn. I don't think you'd need more than 1 additional skein. In the larger sizes, you may want up to 2 additional skeins. It depends upon how long your arms are, how long you're going to have this body. But the thing about changing length is generally you are going to need to know your row gauge. You're going to need to know how long you want your sleeve to be, and then you want to just subtract the length of the sleeve in the pattern from the length of the sleeve you want. That's how much more you need to knit. And then you want to spread that out over the length of the sleeve. You probably don't want to do all the increases right away and have the increases be here and then just have a big tube of fabric up here. Generally, we like a gentler slope. So, you know, the easy thing to do would be to say, add 2 more rows between the increases. That's a pretty basic one. And I think we're doing, how many sets of increases do we do on the sleeve? Let's take a look. So we do it like 6 more times, 7 more times, 8 more times. So you'd want to figure out how many sets of increases you have and how many more rows you need to work, and then divide that evenly to get your longer sleeves. And a similar thing for the body. We'll get into that more in the body episodes, and we're going to do 3 episodes on the body. So we can talk about where you want to place the fabric for your sweater. But as a general rule, I think sleeves, I think I can give a more blanket statement that you want to spread any increases out or spread any additional fabric you're going to create over all the increases of the sleeve. So I think that's everything for today. We have talked about the 2-tail long-tail cast on, which is my favorite. We've talked about the increases and the best way to make them. We've talked about how you could lengthen your sleeve. Oh, and remember, don't slip the stitches on the sleeve. You will want to slip the stitches on the body at the beginning of the row. We'll have that nice chain edge, but here you don't want to. And you're going to want, and the great thing about the 2-tail long-tail cast on is it sets you up right away to alternate skeins, which is especially good if you are using hand-dyed yarn, which has variations in it, and you want to mix those variations together to create a beautiful cohesive fabric. So thank you so much for joining me. If you haven't subscribed to my YouTube channel, you can do that right over I think it's over there. Just click the button and subscribe, and you will get notified when new episodes go live. If you haven't, subscribe to the newsletter at kathleendames.com/thesweater. And if you are knitting along with me, feel free to share your projects on social media, tag them with the hashtag KDSweater. And for this one, of course, Solstice Cardi. I'm on Instagram and Twitter, as well as Facebook. And be sure to join me on the forums at Kathleen Dames Design on Ravelry. Each episode will have its own thread, so if questions come up while you're watching this episode, that's a great place to post them. Even if I don't get around to answering it as quickly as you post it, there are lots of other people who are knitting this sweater, and they may have the answer for you first. So thank you so much for joining me. I hope you're having fun so far. I'm excited to go and fully cast on my sleeve, and I'll be back next week where we will talk about casting on again and a few other tips and tricks for knitting the body. Until then, have a great day and happy knitting. Bye. Many thanks to Karen at Roundtable Yarns, Natalie at Remembrances Pottery, Corinna at Picnic Knits, Tara Swiger, and all my fellow Starship Captains, and you for being a part of The Sweater. For more information, visit kathleendames.com/thesweater. You can find links to everything I've talked about in the show notes. Thank you so much for listening to The Sweater with Kathleen Dames.